So today I want to talk about what it takes to see results once you're past the age of 40 and how to maintain those results, purely today from a training only perspective. And I'm not talking about your average 40-year-old guy's results down at your Jets gym. I'm talking about training that is good enough to generate results equivalent like you're in your 20s again. So today, we're going to look at what your training now needs to look like, what the differences are now, what has to be taken into consideration, as well as the consistencies that still need to remain from your training in your 20s, now training in your 40s. Now, the first thing to understand is that training, resistance training, for anyone of any age. The purpose of resistance training is to inflict a stimulus on your body that causes a cascade of physiological processes that result in your physique adapting appropriately in line with the type of external training stimulus you inflicted on it. You could be 20, 30, 40, whatever. It doesn't matter. That is the purpose, that is the goal, and that is the effect of resistance training. First thing we need to look at now that we're training as a middle-aged man is your changing relationship and changing response to your training frequency, training volume, and training intensity. We've done a whole video on these critical factors in a previous video, so please be sure to go back and watch that. Understanding the relationship that they all have with each other is critical for anyone of any age, so please do go back and watch the video. Assuming that you have watched the video, this is the first factor as into how your training needs to change past the age of 40. As you age, training volume, as in how much workload you are performing in a single session, becomes less and less of your friend. The days of you being able to pump out a chest session consisting of 20 working sets and actually benefiting from that workout, getting the growth response that you want, are gone or becoming less and less. Why? Due to your increased central nervous system recovery demands that continue to increase further over the years. Recovering from high volume sessions becomes harder and harder. And this is the key here. You can only grow from what you can recover from. So as training volume becomes less of your friend, as the years go on, likely running you into a ton of recovery and wear and tear problems, we need to instead favor the other training variables. Training intensity and training frequency need to become your biggest and most used weapons when it comes to your training past the age of 40. The next thing I want you to understand is you still need to train hard. You still need to train with high intensity. And in my opinion and experience of transforming thousands of middle-aged guys' physiques, training to failure, the highest intensity you can go, needs to be present. Please understand, you have to give your body a reason to want to change. You have to generate enough of a stimulus that triggers the physiological growth pathways. And if we don't have the option of doing loads of volume anymore to achieve that response, the reduced workload that you are doing better be good enough to generate enough of an effective stimulus. Training to full contractile failure, high intensity, is key. Then comes the factor of frequency, as in how often you train a particular muscle over a week's period. If you have your training volume low, and even if you have your intensity high, we likely can afford to run the training frequency on the higher side of things. So training past the age of 40 requires still training to full contractile failure. Training volume low, as in less working sets within your individual sessions, but visiting training the same muscle group more often. Let's say you used to train 15 working sets on a particular muscle group in a single session, and that used to work for you. You used to be able to recover from that and see results from that. Now, you do that, doing that volume would put you in a world of grief. So instead, if we take that 15 sets and distribute that over, say, 3 workouts over a 7-day period instead, we can still generate the weekly volume, but are running it in low volume sessions, which means less central nervous system fatigue is being generated, which means we can get away with higher frequency. A huge benefit to this as well is the reduction of intra-session fatigue. You perform a chest session of 15 working sets in a single session. I can guarantee the back end of your session is going to be sub-maximal due to the accumulating fatigue that builds up over the session. The weights you're lifting in those last 9 to 15 sets aren't going to generate anywhere as much stimulus on the targeted muscle group as the weights you're lifting earlier on in the session will be. And remember, the internal stimulus for change is a direct proportionate reaction from the external stimulus. Reducing training volume per session and increasing frequency gives you the opportunity to lift at your max more often, or at least an increased output ability, as opposed to just performing everything in a single session. So summarizing the first point to how you need to be training once you pass 40. Training volume per session, that needs to be far lower now. Training intensity, as in how many sets perform to failure, well, that needs to be high. Training frequency can likely afford to favor the higher side of the scale too. Now, as your development changes and you still progress, as long as other external contributors outside of the gym, things like your nutrition, your sleep hormones, but we're not going to cover or go into that in this video. But the balance and playing with volume and frequency can need to change. But for a lot of cases, high intensity, highish frequency, and low volume sessions is the safest bet to continue to build upon. The next factor is standardize your form. This is important for anyone of any age serious about seeing results in the gym and progressing, but it becomes an unforgiving factor if it is not implemented the older you get. So what do I mean standardize your form? Setting things in place to have every single rep that you perform executed exactly the same depth, the same plane of contraction, the exact range of motion. Every time you perform the same exercise in your repeating workouts, you need your form standardized. So you are building on an execution of consistency. See, progressive overload, which is always the pursuit of trying to perform just a tiny bit more than you did the session before, only works if that performing more weight, more reps, is across the exact same executed repetition form. Why is this important to us old boys? Because as explained, we have a reduced ceiling to the amount of training volume we can perform in a single session. You don't want to be wasting your time and effort on not properly executing reps that are going to facilitate effective physique changing progressive overload. You need to be picky with this and bring picky attention to detail on it. Let's say you're doing a hammer press. Know exactly the height the seat is, so your humerus travels the exact plane of movement every single rep, every single time, every single session that you happen to perform that exercise. Know exactly how your back is positioned against the backrest, so the angle of your torso doesn't change from one workout to the next and therefore changes the tension on the chest from one set to the next. Know the exact depth of your shoulder press. Set stoppers up so you know just to touch the stopper on every single rep, so you hit the exact depth, exact range, exact movement every time you perform that exercise. That's actually one of the reasons I do love incorporating a lot of machines into my clients' programs, because machines are easy to standardize. Now that doesn't mean you can't standardize on free weight exercises, but you do have to be more diligent and stay intensely focused on every rep you do perform in a free weight movement. Third factor, your individual biomechanics better be taken into account. We are all built different. Lever lengths, lever to torso ratios different from individual to individual, and in turn, the way we move differs from each other. In turn, our individual muscle contraction, they differ as well. As a result of that, one exercise might suit someone's individual biomechanics and structure perfectly, and as a result, be able to generate a ton of physique-changing stimulus from it, while the exact same exercise might be submaximal for someone with different lever ratios. Example of this is the barbell squats. Often those with structure ratios that favor a longer torso, shorter thigh bone ratios, and longer shin bones are biomechanically set up to squat. Their structure favors this movement. In turn, they will be able to generate more force, move more weight, and keep the load in the targeted muscle groups so much easier and better than someone who doesn't have those favorable squatting ratios. It doesn't mean that the guy who isn't built perfectly for squats isn't going to benefit at all from squats, but he's not going to generate the same level of targeted stimulus as someone who is favorable to that movement. Either the individual squat position setup and execution needs to be customized and adjusted to help work with the unfavorable individual structure, or use other exercises better suited to the individual's biomechanic. Again, this is from the point of view that we have a decreased amount of training volume that we have to spend. So you better be spending it on exercises that are going to generate the most return on your effort investment. And there is no better way of doing this than performing a full structural assessment before your training program is designed for you. Something I do with every single one of my clients. Orthopedic considerations. Yeah, look, I know. Just the sound of that makes you feel ancient, right? Yeah, don't worry, it does to me too. But unfortunately, this is something we have to take into account if we want to not only see epic results, but maintain them. No good reaching your goal, then have your soft connective tissues blow out and leave you not able to train, and having all of your results slip away. What a waste. What we have to realize and accept is that we have more mileage on the clock being over 40. There is more wear, more tear, and use on our connective tissues and joints. No matter how much we might have looked after them, looked after our bodies, which to be honest, most of us haven't anyway, but our joints are now, even good joints at 40, aren't as good as 20-year-old joints that we once had. So our training needs to take this into account. First, the fact that we are favoring a lower amount of volume in a session is a good thing. It's kind of the same as you have less chance of getting hit by a car the less times you cross the road. Same in this case. We're training intensely to failure, which yes, does mean heavier weights and stress on the soft connective tissues. That's increased, but it's across less working sets. So while it's hard and intense, it's only over a small amount of workload. This is the risk and reward factor. Yes, it's an increase in risk to lift heavier, but that's what we need to generate a growth response. We're better off doing that than beat our central nervous system down and repetitively using the joints over and over in a high volume session. Also, there is no shame in using knee wraps, elbow sleeves, wrist supports if that is going to help stabilize the joints, help lessen injury, and actually help standardize your form as well. I'll often use wrist wraps just to lock my wrists in place to be sure I'm pushing through the exact portion of my palm each and every time to make sure my press movements is standardized, helping both to look after my joints and helping further standardize my output. Hypertrophy drivers. Progressive overload is the most important training factor, but we can't keep pushing 100% of all the effort all the time on this. That is like redlining a car all the time. Okay, so this one has the potential for me to end up deep in a geek hole and be talking about this for hours, but for the sake of this video and attempting to get it under a certain ideal time, I'll keep this as concise as possible. Your skeletal muscles are triggered to grow from a number of different mechanisms. The different variables in your training sessions that you perform, and depending on which ones you favor, will tap into these different mechanisms to different degrees. First, mechanical tension, which is basically your muscle triggered to respond with a growth response because an external load is placed on the muscle as it goes through its contraction range, from lengthened to shortened. The principle of progressive overload that I mentioned earlier, always trying to perform just a fraction more every time you visit the same exercise again in your training, is a surefire way of generating high amounts of effective mechanical tension every time you train. However, there are other mechanisms as well. Now, while they don't generate as much growth stimulus as mechanical tension, they are still extremely beneficial to include within your training. These are metabolic stress and muscle damage. Metabolic stress is basically the accumulation of anabolic byproducts in the targeted muscle group when you are training. You know that muscle pump feel where there's that burning sensation in the muscle and the skin feels like it's literally about to split? That is lactic acid, blood, water, nutrients, and other anabolic byproducts accumulating in the muscle. This accumulation in the muscle has a growth response to the muscle cells themselves. Then there is muscle damage, which is where the muscle fibers themselves undergo microscopic damage due to the training you're inflicting on it. This damage mostly occurs under the concentration of eccentric focus movements, where the muscle is lengthening under loads, or via the use of intensifier techniques that are designed to take you past the point of failure, where you hit failure on a working set, and instead of stopping and ending the set, you might perform a drop set, or perform partial repetitions, or might perform rest pause reps. All techniques like this will create more structural damage to the actual fibers, in turn triggering urgent repair and growth responses. What I want you to note here is to bring about metabolic stress and muscle damage, you don't need to be following the principle of progressive overload like you do with mechanical tension. These two mechanisms can be generated through purely intelligent training programming within your sessions, and of course with focused execution. But while they are both effective mechanisms to spark growth, ensuring effective progressive overload is designed into your programming to generate consistent and high levels of mechanical tension is still the best and most proven for generating growth. So why not just only concentrate on mechanical tension 100% of the time across absolutely every exercises and set we ever do? Well, think of it like this. Using progressive overload to push mechanical tension is like driving your Ferrari and redlining it. You'll get there fast, but eventually, if you keep redlining it, even with a finely tuned and engineered Ferrari engine, you will run into trouble. Sometimes you need to take the foot off the pedal to take the corners, right? That's what muscle damage and metabolic stress is. Still moving forward, still progressing, but doing it in a manner that isn't redlining to get through the corners. So then you can open it up again with mechanical tension again until you take on the next set of corners. So to summarize, over the age of 40, wanting to see epic results, but maintainable results, your training must favor training intensity and training frequency over training volume. You must learn and be consistent with standardizing your form. Have individual biomechanics and structure taken into account and factored into your program and exercise selection. Take into account orthopedic considerations. You break, you're in a world of trouble and in a world of regression. Ensure your program intelligently makes the right use of different hypertrophy mechanisms that are at your disposal. So if you found this video helpful and of use, be sure to give the video a like, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications because we've got more videos lined up like this, all designed to help you progress with your health and fitness goals in the most effective way possible.